Welcome to the lecture for Lesson 3. Today's lesson is rather short compared to the last lecture, but this lecture will build off of much of what you learned in the last lesson. Today we will cover prepositions, the definite article, and the direct object marker. Let's dig in. This is an example of the usage of the Hebrew definite article. The first word is heavens. The second word is the heavens. Can you tell what's different and what made the second word definite as the heavens? If you said hey plus patak as the vowel under the hey, plus a dagesh forte in the first letter of the word, you are correct. This is the mark for the Hebrew definite article. Of course, learning rules of a language would not be anywhere near as much fun if it were not for exceptions. There are several exceptions to the hey plus patak plus dagesh forte rule. All exceptions are exceptions we have already seen when discussing the relationship between dagesh forte and gutturals in the last lesson. For one thing, we know that gutturals reject dagesh forte, causing the patak under the hey to lengthen to kamets. In the case of another hey, or the letter chet, the patak remains and the dagesh will simply be assumed. However, before a hey, chet, or ayin with a kamets, the patak under the hey of the definite article typically becomes a segol. And of course, don't forget about Skinnem-Levy letters. When sibilants, kof, nun, mem, lamed, vav, or yod have a vocal schwa, they too will lose the dagesh forte of the definite article. But, like hey and chet, the patak under the hey of the definite article remains and is simply implied. This may seem like a lot, so let's make it simple. What do all of these usages of the definite article have in common? Of course, it's the letter hey. So rather than memorizing all the possible vowels that could appear under the letter hey, let's learn simply 3 questions. First, is the letter hey added on to the word or part of the word? Vocabulary here helps. If the hey is extra, we need to ask if the word the hey is prefixed to is a finite verb. If the answer is yes, this is not a definite article, because you cannot have an article on a verb. Of course, we'll have to double check that the form of the verb is not infinite, as an infinitive, or a participle, both of which we will learn later, since these forms are more like nouns than verbs and will take the article. But both of these forms are pretty obvious, so don't worry about it for now. In essence, if the word is a finite verb, it's not a definite article. And finally, the only other time a hey shows up at the beginning of a word is if it is the Hebrew question mark. This is almost always pointed with a patak shva and will always be at the beginning of the question. So if it's not a question, if the hey is extra, and it's not on a verb, it's the definite article. Now to discuss the conjunctive vav, which is translated as and, although technically the vav is also used as the disjunctive, but. The first example in the list here gives the typical form, vav plus a vocal schwa. Like the definite article, there are several exceptions. Before the bump letters, bait, mem, or pei, or before a vocal schwa on the first letter of the word, the vav with the vocal schwa will become a shurik, or a long u. If the vav plus the vocal schwa comes before or is prefixed to a word starting with a letter with a compound schwa, found on the gutturals, as in example 4, the schwa in the vav takes the short vowel of that compound schwa. Like with the definite article, it's easier to see what these words all have in common than to memorize vowel patterns, unless, like me, you enjoy that sort of thing. So what do these words all have in common to give them the word and or but at the beginning of the word? The vav, of course. And here's the great news. Only about 20 words in the Hebrew Bible start with vav. I don't mean 20 different words that occur over and over again. I mean 20 occurrences total in the whole Bible. And the word vav, meaning hook or peg, makes up about 10 of those occurrences and is only found in the book of Exodus. Which means if you assume that every time you see a vav on the front of a word it must be and or but, you'd be wrong only 10 or so times in the entire Old Testament. Which is not bad odds, I would say. However, before you completely disregard everything I said then on how and why the vocal schwa under the Vav changes, realize that vocal schwa also occurs under 3 of the 4 prepositions that will be found prefixed to words. Lamed, Beit, and Kaf all have a vocal schwa. In addition, all 3 will only be found prefixed to another word. Min, on the other hand, can be found alone or prefixed to another word. So let's look again at the exceptions. Exceptions that are quite similar to the exceptions for schwa and dagesh we have already seen with the definite article and the conjunctive disjunctive vav, because, let's face it, gutturals are annoying. What is listed first here is an example of the nun in mim, the preposition from, assimilating into the next letter. The dagesh in the second mem is the nun. Technically, this is not true. The dagesh is not actually the nun, it's just a dagesh forte, but I like to think of it as the nun to help me to remember the form for the preposition mim. The second example is what happens if that letter that is supposed to take the dagesh forte from the nun is a guttural. The guttural rejects the dagesh, and the vowel under the mem, which is typically a hirik, lengthens and becomes sere. Gutturals also affect the other prepositions. For instance, in the third example here, rather than beit, the preposition in, on, or about, with the vocal schwa prefixing itself here, the schwa under the beit runs into the schwa under the ayin. Since the schwa under the ayin is a compound schwa, or hatef patak, the schwa under the beit becomes a patak instead of a vocal schwa. This will really happen any time in a word where a schwa is followed by a compound schwa. The first schwa will become the half vowel or hatef vowel of the compound schwa. Of course, you might be asking, what if the prefix comes before the definite article? Well, I'm glad you asked. For min, the preposition will simply be written separately. Beit, lamed, and kaf do not have that option, so instead, as you see in the fourth example here, they take the vowel of the definite article and retain the dagesh forte in the first letter of the word. So beit with a schwa under it is in a, but beit with a vowel under it, unless it is copying a compound schwa that follows, is in the. Typically, when 2 schwas run into each other, the first schwa becomes a hirik. I like to think of it as 2 schwas fighting. The second schwa stabs the first schwa in the eye, so that it takes away one of the eyes, or one of the dots, leaving it with only one eye, one dot, which is hirik. I find that Hebrew is more memorable the more violent you make it. We have, however, the same problem with prepositions taking over the definite article when they run into gutturals. In this word, as an example here, the beit preposition, on, in, or upon, took the patak from the definite article and the dagesh forte. But as you see in the second example, the aleph rejected the dagesh forte, which lengthens the previous vowel, causing the patak to become a kametz. Of course, aleph has a mind of its own, so sometimes instead of only lengthening, the vowel associated with the aleph will drop out completely, as in the word lemor, here, which means saying or to say. We say that the aleph quiesces, it goes silent. In fact, it's sometimes easier to get used to seeing a lamed, beit, mem, or kaf at the beginning of a word and simply asking what it's there for, rather than memorizing all sorts of vowel combinations. Just remember that 2 schwas together fight and make the first schwa into a hirik, having lost an eye or a dot. If the second schwa is a compound schwa, the first schwa will not take a hirik but the vowel of the compound schwa. Connected prepositions absorb the behavior of the definite article, including the annoyance of gutturals, and changes of the gutturals because of the rejection of the dagesh. One final piece to mention. This is the direct object marker. If the indirect object is who you sent the letter to, the direct object is the actual letter. I mailed the letter. One catch, which actually makes the direct object marker easier to spot, is that the direct object marker, which is always by itself, occurs mostly in prose, nowhere near as often in poetry. And it is only found on definite nouns, not indefinite. So it is the letter, not a letter. Well, we've reached the end of another lesson. Rewatch this lesson until you learn the content, then use the Quizlet link to quiz yourself in order to prepare for the next class.